Red John is one of the most challenging killers in fiction to rank detectives against, because catching him isn't just about raw intelligence. Many fictional characters can solve murders, but Red John is different. He doesn't merely hide evidence, he conceals himself within an entire system, employing fear, manipulation, and psychological warfare simultaneously. He doesn't just want to avoid capture, he wants to control the experience of being hunted. This makes him a distinctly different adversary compared to most serial killers. So, for this list, I won't be looking at who is the smartest detective on paper. Instead, I'm assessing who could genuinely survive the Red John experience, who could navigate a compromised law enforcement system, and ultimately, who could put him behind bars. Some detectives might succeed, while others, despite their brilliance, are simply ill-suited for this particular opponent. Welcome to Star Radar, where we delve into the minds of fiction's greatest investigators to see if they could outwit the elusive Red John. Some of our picks might surprise you, especially when we consider the psychological toll this villain inflicts. Our ranking system is as follows. S tier, they would successfully put Red John behind bars. A tier, they would uncover Red John's identity but fail to gather sufficient proof for an arrest. B tier, they would develop a suspicion, an instinct that something is amiss with a particular individual, but lack any concrete evidence. C tier, completely outmatched. They would have absolutely no genuine leads or understanding of Red John's true nature. First up, we have James Dokes. Now, this is my personal favorite character from Dexter, and I'll defend that opinion to my grave, but that's a topic for another video. As we know, Dokes possesses incredibly sharp instincts. If something is off, he senses it immediately, much like his gut feeling about Dexter when no one else in the precinct noticed anything amiss. So, in a world where Dokes crosses paths with Red John, or even some of his operatives, I firmly believe he would sense that something rotten permeates that part of town. The problem is that instincts alone are insufficient against Red John. Red John isn't hiding by acting normal in the office, as Dexter did. He creates distance through his extensive networks, and he is, in fact, quite normal. He doesn't just act normal, he genuinely is normal. If Patrick Jane couldn't immediately sense something off about Red John during their first encounter when Red John was in police uniform, there's no way Dokes could. The moment Dokes starts stomping around loudly and making himself a threat, Red John will undoubtedly notice. As he did with Dexter, Red John made it clear he was watching him, even explicitly stating, "I'm watching you." Dokes doesn't operate subtly, and against someone unafraid to kill, that would be his biggest mistake. While Dokes has a keen instinct for society's oddballs, Red John isn't an oddball. This might come as a surprise, but I believe James Dokes would genuinely be completely outmatched. Red John is simply too normal for Dokes to even suspect anything is wrong with him. Next, we have Rust Cohle. Rust is one of the most natural fits for this case among all the detectives discussed. What makes Rust so effective in this situation isn't just his intelligence, but that he already views the world through the exact lens required for a Red John investigation. Rust naturally assumes that evil doesn't just reside in one man, but within the structures that protect that man. He has, after all, dealt with a case eerily similar to Red John's in his own show, True Detective. This mindset immediately puts him ahead. He would quickly begin to question who is assisting Red John, who is covering for him, and why leads suddenly collapse. Rust is also difficult to scare in the traditional sense, making Red John's creepy tactics less effective on him than on a more emotionally exposed detective. The reason I wouldn't say he would put Red John behind bars is that Rust is also quite self-destructive. He possesses an obsessive edge where a case could consume him in a detrimental way. I fully believe he could unravel Red John's network and expose the truth, but whether it culminates in a clean arrest or a messy showdown is where doubt arises. Therefore, I genuinely think Rust Cohle would discover Red John's identity, but he might not gather enough evidence for a clean conviction. Then we have Elle from Death Note. Genuinely, this might be the most mentally exhausting detective Red John could ever encounter. L is a nightmare matchup because he strips all emotion and theatrics from the case. Red John thrives when his pursuer is angry, desperate, or simply emotional. L, however, embodies none of these traits. He's peculiar, but in a good way, weird, yet impossible to read. This alone makes him incredibly difficult to manipulate. If Red John can't manipulate you, he's essentially defeated from the start. The key with L is that he doesn't need to understand Red John on an emotional level to beat him. Once L begins to perceive the web of false leads and law enforcement manipulation, he will quickly realize that he isn't hunting a mere serial killer, but a man with significant power. Once he understands that, it's essentially game over. Red John would absolutely despise dealing with L because he wouldn't be able to get inside his head in the same way he typically does with investigators, who often have a personal history with him, perhaps having lost family members. Moreover, L wouldn't have to prove the existence of the supernatural to win this case, and for him, if there's no supernatural element involved, it's a guaranteed victory. So, L would 100% put Red John behind bars with relative ease. There's no doubt in my mind. Next we have Will Graham. Will is probably the most dangerous detective here in terms of pure psychological understanding, but he is also one of the most vulnerable. This makes him such an unusual case. On one hand, Will would likely understand Red John better than almost anyone else. He would instantly grasp the performance, the ego, and the way Red John transforms the act of killing into a message. He would feel all of that almost immediately. The problem is that Red John would relish this. Will's empathy is essentially an open door that allows him to enter the minds of monsters. But against Red John, that same gift could become a curse, much as it was for Hannibal. Red John wouldn't just want to evade Will, he would want to contaminate him. He would want Will confused and emotionally compromised. So, while I believe Will would uncover significant pieces of the truth, I also think Red John possesses the exact psychological toolkit, similar to Hannibal's, to drag Will into deep mental waters. That is why I cannot say he would put Red John behind bars. I believe Will Graham has the mind to figure out Red John's identity, but I don't think he would gather enough evidence due to his vulnerability. Then we have Frank Lundy. This is one of the picks that people might overlook because he's not as flashy as some of the others, but Lundy would actually perform quite well here. What I appreciate about Lundy in a Red John scenario is his patience and his skill at identifying long-term behavioral patterns. He is very comfortable slowly building a profile and gradually closing in, much as he did with the Trinity Killer, a case he pursued for decades and came incredibly close to solving. Against a killer like Red John, this approach holds value because Red John often relies on investigators rushing and panicking. The issue is that Red John is more than just a serial pattern killer like the Trinity Killer. He is a master manipulator with far-reaching influence. This is where I begin to question if Lundy could fully overcome those high-level stakes. Furthermore, we never truly saw him display that type of defense in Dexter. He wasn't pitted against an entire corrupt organization, so I'm unsure how he would fare against that. I just don't know if he possesses the extra gear needed to cut through all the human corruption surrounding the case. Therefore, I honestly believe he would only manage to develop a suspicion. Next, we have Alex Mahone. Alex Mahone is one of the more underrated picks on this list, and I actually think he would be quite dangerous for Red John. Alex is one of those detectives incredibly skilled at getting inside the minds of highly intelligent criminals without becoming overly romantic about it. He doesn't require impressive deduction moments. He's practical and very adept at reverse engineering someone's thought processes. This is crucial against Red John, who constantly tries to force investigators to react emotionally while he remains hidden behind layers of protection. The main concern is that Red John is far more socially embedded than most criminals Mahone has ever dealt with. However, I also believe Mahone is smart enough to adapt once he realizes that the entire system is corrupted. While he might not have insane resources, he possesses enough intelligence to give Red John a serious challenge. Would I say he finds out about Red John's identity? Honestly, yes, I would. Next up, Batman. This is one of the worst possible matchups for Red John ever. Batman is genuinely the detective you'd create in a lab to deal with this exact type of criminal. For all my Batman fans, you know he has spent his entire career dismantling individuals precisely like Red John. Corruption is practically Batman's middle name. He's gone after the Joker, the Riddler, Hush, and even the Court of Owls. For Batman, Red John would truly be a walk in the park. I think Red John would quickly realize that Batman is not someone he can toy with at all, because, unlike Patrick Jane, Batman won't obsessively play Red John's game on Red John's terms, that's for sure. And technically, Batman doesn't really need evidence to put someone away. He could simply take you to Arkham Asylum and throw you in there. He doesn't play games. I would even place Batman above L, I'm not going to lie. Following that, we have Sherlock Holmes. Honestly, this comes as no surprise. I feel like we wouldn't even need to discuss this because it's widely known that Sherlock Holmes is one of the greatest detectives ever. I would genuinely say that Sherlock Holmes is a better detective than Batman purely based on his detective skills. So, it would simply be illogical not to place Sherlock Holmes in the same tier as these two. Last but not least, we have David Mills and Somerset from Seven. Somerset would absolutely have to carry this case. David Mills is more emotional, but he possesses a tremendous amount of heart when it comes to detective work, arguably more than Somerset. Somerset is cool, calm, methodical, and intelligent, while David Mills is the opposite, with the fire, instinct, and aggression that can make a detective dangerous in a fast-moving case. However, given that we are up against Red John, who enjoys killing family members to emotionally destroy his targets, much like he did with Patrick Jane, and considering David Mills also experienced this when John Doe tragically decapitated his wife, I feel David Mills would not fare well in this situation. Somerset would be the one needing to keep David Mills on the right track. Therefore, rating both of them together, they would be genuinely completely outmatched against Red John. Perhaps they might develop a suspicion that Red John is the killer, but I highly doubt even that.